Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your companion for another quiet evening of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there a document before you, a letter perhaps, or an old book left open on the table? Watson knew that the most consequential secrets are rarely hidden far. They rest in plain sight, inside the papers we file away and the names we agree without discussion never to mention. Do subscribe so no story in the margin goes unread. Now, settle in. For as Holmes understood, it is not the bold lie that conceals the truth, but the careful silence kept around it. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. Chapter 1. The House at Belgrave Square. There are evenings in London when the fog descends not merely upon the streets, but upon the spirit itself, wrapping the city in a cold and sullen silence that discourages all enterprise and renders the drawing-room fire an object of peculiar devotion. Such an evening it was in the latter days of November, in the year of which I now write, when I sat opposite Sherlock Holmes in our Baker Street rooms, engaged with no greater occupation than a week-old copy of the Lancet and the pleasant torpor of a well-earned rest. Holmes was in one of his restless phases. He had been without a case of any substance for the better part of a fortnight, and the familiar signs of intellectual stagnation were upon him. The violin laid across his knees and played in disconnected fragments. The tobacco consumed in quantities which I, as a medical man, found alarming, and the long intervals of motionless contemplation during which he stared at the ceiling with an expression of such concentrated misery that a stranger might have supposed him afflicted by some profound personal grief. I knew better. It was merely the extraordinary mind protesting its own disuse. I had just set aside my journal and was debating the merits of an early retirement when Mrs. Hudson's measured tread upon the stair announced a visitor. The hour was past 9, the fog thicker than ever against the window glass, and yet Holmes straightened almost imperceptibly in his chair, some animal instinct alert to the possibility of stimulus. "A lady," said he before the knock came. "She has hesitated twice upon the landing. Whatever brings her here has been debated and nearly abandoned on at least 2 prior occasions." I had ceased to ask Holmes how he arrived at such conclusions before the fact. Experience had taught me to await their confirmation. The knock came, Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon her tray, and Holmes glanced at it with an expression of sudden and concentrated interest. "Lady Agatha Merrodine," he read aloud, and something in his tone suggested that the name was not entirely unfamiliar. "Show her up, Mrs. Hudson." The woman who entered our sitting room a moment later was of the species which England's great houses produce in considerable number, and which, once encountered, is never easily forgotten. She was perhaps 60 years of age, though she carried herself with the rigid composure of a much younger woman who has learned, through long practice, that composure is among the more reliable defences available to her sex. Her mourning was not recent. The dress was of good quality but had seen many seasons, and yet she wore it with a precision which suggested that the observance was maintained by principle rather than immediate grief. Her face was handsome in an austere fashion, the brow high and intelligent, the eyes a clear and rather formidable grey. "Mr. Holmes," said she, accepting the chair I had hurriedly placed for her with a brief inclination of the head. "I am told that you are a man of discretion, as well as ability. In the matter which has brought me here this evening, the former quality is, if anything, the more essential of the two." "You may rely upon my discretion absolutely," said Holmes, settling back into his chair with an air of complete attention. "Dr. Watson, who shares these rooms, is my trusted associate in all such matters, and is no less trustworthy than myself. Pray proceed, Lady Agatha." She appeared to weigh this assurance for a moment, glancing briefly at me with those clear grey eyes before arriving at some private resolution. "My late husband," she began, "was Sir Edmund Merrodine, for many years a judge of the Court of Chancery. He died 4 years ago, and since that time I have resided at our house in Belgrave Square, where the management of the family's affairs has occupied me more considerably than I might have wished. Sir Edmund was a man of great distinction, and, I may say, of exemplary probity. The Merodine name is one which has stood in legal circles and beyond as synonymous with honour. She paused as though the word had cost her something. There is at present before the Court of Probate a matter concerning the Merodine inheritance. My nephew, Percival Merodine, is the principal heir, though his claim depends upon the validation of certain documents relating to his mother's marriage abroad. The proceedings have been, until recently, progressing in the ordinary fashion. Holmes had steepled his fingers and was regarding our visitor with the particular quality of attention he reserved for cases which had begun to interest him. "Until recently," he repeated. "And what has altered the ordinary fashion of events?" "A court usher," said Lady Agatha, and the phrase fell from her lips with the distaste of a woman unaccustomed to concerning herself with functionaries of that station. "A man named Edwin Phelps, who has for some years been attached to the probate court. He has disappeared." "Disappeared?" said Holmes. "Since when?" "He was last seen 4 days ago. The police have been informed, and they have come to various conclusions which I do not find satisfactory. But it is not the disappearance itself which brings me to you, Mr. Holmes." "No," said Holmes with perfect equanimity. "I rather supposed it was not." Lady Agatha's chin rose slightly. "It has come to my attention, through channels which I shall not specify, that Phelps, before his disappearance, was alleged to have accepted a bribe connected with the Merodine proceedings. The nature of the bribe and the identity of the party who offered it are unknown to me. What I know with certainty is that any public association between the name of Merodine and an allegation of bribery, regardless of whether the allegation is founded in fact, would be a catastrophe of the first order." "I see," said Holmes. "And you wish me to discover the truth before the matter becomes a public catastrophe?" "I wish you to discover whatever there is to be discovered," said Lady Agatha, with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed the phrase, "and to advise me accordingly." It was, I noticed, a carefully delimited instruction. She was not asking Holmes to suppress the truth. She was not asking him to find evidence of innocence where none might exist. She was asking, in the oblique manner of the well-bred English woman of her generation, for information, with the implication, left entirely unspoken, that what she did with that information would remain her own affair. Holmes appeared to notice this too. He said nothing of it. "Your household at Belgrave Square," said he. "You will tell me something of its composition." Lady Agatha described it with the conciseness of a woman who has long managed a large establishment and does not waste words upon it. There was Percival Merodine himself. Charming, she said, and the word carried a faint reservation, as though charm were not quite among the virtues she most admired, currently residing at the house whilst the probate proceedings continued. There was Evelyn Harbury, her niece on her mother's side, a young woman of limited means who had lived under Lady Agatha's roof for the past 3 years. There was Major Lionel Vane, her cousin, who called frequently, and whose financial affairs she described with a brevity that spoke volumes. And there was Mr. Silas Broom, the family solicitor, who attended regularly, and whose acquaintance with every aspect of the Merodine affairs was, she implied, comprehensive. "And your domestic staff?" Holmes inquired. "They are few and long established. Mrs. Finch has served as my housekeeper for 22 years. The others need not concern you." Holmes gave a slight nod, and I recognised in it the acknowledgment of information filed rather than dismissed. "One further question for tonight, Lady Agatha. When you learned of the allegation against Phelps, what was your first concern?" She regarded him steadily. "The dignity of the family name," said she, "not the guilt or innocence of any party, not the fate of the inheritance proceedings themselves. Those are secondary matters, Mr. Holmes. Institutions and estates may be repaired. Reputation, once publicly stained, is a far more delicate thing." After she'd gone, Holmes sat for a long while without speaking, the tips of his fingers pressed together, his gaze directed toward the fire. I refilled my pipe and waited, knowing that interruption at such moments was fruitless. "Well, Watson," he said at last. A formidable woman, I offered. Undoubtedly. But consider what she did not say. She did not ask whether Phelps was guilty of accepting the bribe. She did not inquire who might have offered it, or why. She did not express any concern for the man's disappearance beyond its implications for the family name. He rose abruptly from his chair and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain to gaze at the fog-muffled street below. A woman of that intelligence, with those interests at stake, omits no detail by accident. The question which will occupy us, my dear fellow, is not what Lady Agatha Merodine fears to lose. That is perfectly plain. The question is what she already knows and has elected not to tell us. He let the curtain fall and turned from the window with an expression of settled purpose. "We shall begin at the probate court tomorrow morning," said he. "There is a great deal more to Edwin Phelps than the office of court usher, or I am very much mistaken. In the meantime, I suggest you sleep. We shall need clear heads for this one, Watson. I have a presentiment that the Merodine affair is considerably less straightforward than Lady Agatha would have us believe." I retired shortly afterwards, but it was some time before sleep came to me. Through the wall I could hear the intermittent notes of Holmes's violin, low and pensive in the November darkness, searching, as it always did when his mind was most actively engaged, for some pattern in the silence that lay beyond words. Chapter 2. The Function of a Gatekeeper. The Court of Probate occupies a portion of the great legal precinct that clusters about the Strand, and on a grey November morning it presents to the visitor an aspect of such settled institutional gravity that one feels, entering its precincts, that the concerns of private life must necessarily diminish in proportion. Stone corridors, the smell of old paper and lamp oil, the subdued congress of clerks and barristers moving with the particular unhurried purpose of those whose business is conducted in months and years rather than hours. All of this impressed itself upon me as Holmes and I passed through the outer gate shortly before 10 o'clock the following morning. Holmes had said little at breakfast, which was, in my experience, a reliable indication that he had said a great deal to himself during the night. He moved now through the corridors with the air of a man who has visited such places many times and expects nothing to surprise him, yet misses nothing. I followed half a pace behind, attending to his observations as they came. "The court usher," Holmes remarked, as we paused before a directory board mounted near the central hall, "is one of those figures in English institutional life whose significance is in precise inverse proportion to his apparent station. Judges deliberate, barristers argue, solicitors petition, but it is the usher who controls the physical flow of information within the building, who enters a chamber and when, which documents pass from one desk to another, which petitions are placed at the top of the day's schedule, and which are allowed to settle by degrees toward the bottom. A gatekeeper," I said. "The word is apt, and a gatekeeper who can be persuaded to open or close particular gates at particular times is worth considerably more to a party with interests at stake than any number of expensive legal opinions." He turned from the board. "Come, I have arranged for us to speak with the chief clerk." The chief clerk of the probate division was a small, precise man named Rathbury, who received us in a room so orderly that the papers upon his desk appeared to have been arranged by instrument. He had consented to the interview with a reluctance I suspected was habitual rather than particular, and he received Holmes's inquiries with the careful neutrality of a man who spends his professional life ensuring that nothing he says can be held against him at a later date. "Edwin Phelps," said Rathbury, repeating the name as though identifying a filing category. "He has been attached to this division for 11 years, reliable in the ordinary course, knew the procedures thoroughly. The men here respected his knowledge, if not always his manner." "His manner," Holmes said. "Tell me something of that." Rathbury arranged a pen on his desk by a degree or two. Phelps was a man who understood his own value. He was not insolent, nothing so crude, but he had what I should describe as a developed sense of the leverage his position afforded him. He knew who needed what and when they needed it. Whether he ever acted upon that knowledge improperly, I could not say with certainty. But you suspected he might, I suspected he was the sort of man who would consider it, said Rathbury, with the precision of one who distinguishes carefully between intention and act. Holmes allowed this to settle for a moment, and then asked, with every appearance of casual interest, about Phelps's prior employment. It was here that Rathbury provided our first genuinely useful intelligence. Before his attachment to the probate division, Edwin Phelps had served for 3 years as a clerk to a barrister in the Chancery Courts, a Mr. Aubrey Lyle, now retired, whose practice had included, among many other clients, the estate affairs of the Merrodin family. Holmes received this information with the appearance of mild interest and did not pursue it further in Rathbury's presence. We thanked the chief clerk and withdrew to the corridor. "There it is," said I when we were beyond earshot. "The beginning of a thread," Holmes agreed. "Phelps knew the Merrodin affairs before he ever became an usher. He carried that knowledge with him when he moved to probate. When the Merrodin inheritance case arrived before the division, he was not encountering it for the first time." He paused at a window that overlooked a small interior courtyard, bare of all ornament in the November chill. The question is what precisely he knew, and when he understood that what he knew might be of value. We spent the better part of the morning speaking with 3 other members of the probate staff, a deputy clerk, a filing officer, and a younger usher who had worked alongside Phelps. From these conversations, conducted by Holmes with a patience and apparent guilelessness that never failed to strike me as among his most useful accomplishments, certain facts emerged. On the evening before Phelps's disappearance, he had lingered in the building well past the hour at which his duties required his presence. The filing officer, who had remained late on account of a backlog, observed him near the room in which the Merrodin documents were held. The following morning, several items within the Merrodin case file were found to have been disturbed, not removed, but disordered, as though examined hastily and replaced without care. No formal report had been made, the deputy clerk explained, because the disorder was slight and no documents were conclusively missing. The word conclusively is doing considerable work in that sentence, Holmes murmured to me as we descended the steps into the Strand. The younger usher had provided one further detail. On the afternoon before his disappearance, Phelps had received a sealed envelope, delivered by a private messenger rather than through the ordinary court post. He had placed it in the breast pocket of his coat with a small private expression, which the younger man described, after some prompting from Holmes, as satisfaction. Holmes stood for a moment on the pavement outside, his collar turned against a raw easterly wind, looking not at anything immediately before him, but at some point in the middle distance where, I'd come to understand, his reasoning operated most freely. "So," said he at last, "Phelps spent years in proximity to the Merrodin affairs. He moves to probate, where those affairs eventually come before the court. He examines the documents in his custody, not as part of his official duties, but by night and in haste. He receives a private communication which pleases him, and within 24 hours he has vanished." "Which suggests," I offered, "that the communication contained either a promise or a warning." "Or a meeting place," said Holmes. "But you're right that the emotional register is important. Satisfaction, not alarm. Whatever Phelps believed that envelope contained, he did not fear it. He set off along the Strand at his characteristic pace, which required some effort on my part to match. That tells us something essential about his frame of mind. He thought himself the architect of events rather than their subject. He had discovered something within those case documents, something which he judged to be of sufficient value to bring to the attention of an interested party, and he expected to be rewarded for it. He was, in the language of his profession, managing access. Only this time the gate he proposed to open or close was not a chamber door. "And the interested party," said I. "Someone from the Merrodin household?" Holmes did not answer immediately. We had turned into a side street quieter than the Strand, and he walked for a moment in silence with his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the parties concerned," he said finally. "Percival Merrodin requires the inheritance to rescue himself from ruin. Major Vane is financially broken and has connections to the family. The solicitor Broom stands at the centre of the legal proceedings. Each of them has reason to wish those proceedings to conclude in a particular fashion, and yet I noticed, when Lady Agatha described her household last night, that she spoke of each of them with a distinct variety of restraint. Not the blanket discretion of a woman protecting her family, Watson. Different registers of restraint for different persons. As though she suspected one of them in particular. As though she feared what an investigation might find in each of them, for different reasons. He paused at the corner, and something in his expression became more settled, as it did when a question had moved from the open to the merely unanswered. "We shall call upon Belgrave Square this afternoon. I'm particularly interested in a locked writing room, and in the precise movements of the household on the evening before Phelps was last seen. I asked how he knew of any locked writing room." Holmes permitted himself one of his rare, brief smiles. Lady Agatha mentioned that her household observes rigid etiquette. A woman of that description and that household invariably maintains a private room in which the family papers are kept. That such a room exists is a certainty. That it is relevant to our inquiry is, at present, merely a very strong probability. He stepped into the street to hail a cab. "Come, Watson. We have earned our luncheon." Chapter 3. The Interrupted Hearing. The news reached us before we'd finished our luncheon. Holmes had spread the morning papers across the table at Simpson's in the Strand with the systematic thoroughness he applied to all sources of raw intelligence, moving through them column by column, while I attended to a rather better plate of cold beef than our Baker Street arrangements commonly afforded. It was in the late edition of the Evening Standard, tucked between a parliamentary notice and an advertisement for patent medicines, that the item appeared. 3 short paragraphs, written in the brisk, unsentimental style that London's evening press reserved for deaths of the non-distinguished. The body of a man identified as Edwin Phelps, late of the probate court, had been discovered that morning in a rented room near Temple Bar. The apparent cause of death was a blow to the head, and the room had been comprehensively ransacked. 2 witnesses had reportedly seen a man of military bearing in the vicinity of the lodging-house the previous evening. Police were pursuing several lines of inquiry. The inquest had been scheduled for the following Wednesday. Holmes read it twice, set it aside without comment, and finished his coffee. "Robbery," I said. "That is what the paper implies." "The paper implies whatever makes the most comprehensible narrative for its readership," said Holmes. "Whether the evidence supports that narrative is a separate question entirely." He folded the remaining journals with precision and placed them under his arm. "There is one further item of interest. The Merrodine probate hearing, which was scheduled for this morning, has been postponed indefinitely owing to what the court has described as procedural irregularities. The notice appeared in yesterday's late edition, which I had not previously seen." I put down my fork. "The hearing was postponed before the body was found?" "The notice was published before the body was publicly identified, yes. Whether the postponement and the death are connected by more than coincidence is precisely what we are about to determine." He rose and reached for his coat. "We are expected at Belgrave Square at 3 o'clock. I took the liberty of sending a note this morning." The Merrodine house presented in daylight the same quality of deliberate severity that Lady Agatha herself embodied. It was a substantial late Georgian terrace, maintained with the scrupulous attention of a household that understood appearances as a form of argument. The railings were freshly blacked, the steps clean despite the morning's weather, the brass fittings polished to a subdued gleam that suggested dignity rather than ostentation. A house, I thought, that had been making a case for itself for a very long time. We were admitted by a young housemaid who showed us to a formal drawing-room and withdrew with the noiseless efficiency that spoke of thorough training. The room was furnished in the manner of the previous decade. Good pieces, carefully maintained, no concession to newer fashions. Above the mantelpiece hung a portrait of a man in judicial robes, whom I took to be the late Sir Edmund Merrodine, his expression conveying the settled certainty of one who has spent a professional lifetime deciding matters of consequence. Holmes did not sit. He moved about the room with quiet attention, pausing at the portrait for a moment, then at a small writing table near the window, then at the door that led, I surmised, deeper into the house. When footsteps sounded in the hall, he was standing with every appearance of idle ease before the fire. There were 4 of them. Lady Agatha entered first, with the composed authority of a woman on her own ground. Behind her came a young man of perhaps 30, whom I identified as Percival Merodane, well-made, fair-haired, with the kind of easy, practised manner that suggests a social life conducted largely on credit. Beside him, a young woman I understood to be Evelyn Harbury, slight, dark-eyed, wearing an expression of careful quietness that might have been natural reserve or might have been something more effortful. At the rear, unhurried, came Major Lionel Vane, a big man run somewhat to seed, with the remnants of a soldierly bearing and the complexion of one who has spent time in warmer climates, and rather more time since in London clubs. Holmes offered his condolences upon the death of Phelps, and I watched the room. Percival Merodane appeared for a fraction of a moment to relax. It was not the loosening of grief, but of something more like relief, quickly mastered but present. Evelyn Harbury looked at the carpet. Major Vane met Holmes's eyes with the directness of a man who has decided that directness is his most useful posture, and intends to maintain it regardless of provocation. And Lady Agatha asked whether the newspapers were likely to mention the family name. Not how Phelps had died, not what the police had concluded, whether the newspapers would mention the family. Holmes assured her, with perfect equanimity, that he had seen no indication of this in the morning's reports. She accepted his assurance with a brief nod, as though a minor administrative matter had been satisfactorily resolved. The postponement of the hearing, Holmes said, addressing the room generally. I wonder which of you was informed of it first. A small silence followed, of the kind that is itself informative. Broom notified me yesterday evening, said Lady Agatha, by letter. The solicitor. Yes, and the grounds given were procedural irregularities, a phrase of such commendable vagueness that it might mean almost anything. Did Mr. Broom elaborate? He did not. I expect he will call tomorrow. Holmes appeared to find this satisfactory. He asked several further questions of a general nature, the household's routine, the frequency of Broom's visits, the degree of Percival's direct involvement in the probate proceedings, and received answers that were individually perfectly reasonable and collectively perfectly uninformative. The family had closed ranks in the particular fashion of those who have had long practice at it, not refusing to answer, but answering only what had been asked and not a syllable more. I had been observing the room throughout, and I noted one thing which Holmes had either already marked or would not have needed me to tell him. At the far end of the drawing-room, beyond a pair of tall bookcases, there was a door, heavier than the others, fitted with a more substantial lock, which stood closed. A corridor door, perhaps, or the entrance to an adjoining study. Every member of the household, in the course of the conversation, had at some point directed a brief involuntary glance toward it. In each case the glance was immediately suppressed. In each case the suppression was performed with slightly different degrees of skill. Evelyn Harbury's was the most transparent, Lady Agatha's the most accomplished. As we were preparing to leave, Holmes paused in the hall with the air of a man struck by a thought of no particular urgency. "One small matter," said he, addressing Lady Agatha. "The room at the end of your drawing-room, the one beyond the bookcases. A study, I take it?" "My writing-room," said Lady Agatha without inflection. "Of course. I noticed the lock is of the older pattern. Mortice, if I'm not mistaken. Reliable, but not unpickable. You may wish to consult a locksmith." He smiled pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Lady Agatha." On the pavement outside I turned to him. You cannot seriously have expected her to explain the room. I expected precisely what occurred. She confirmed its existence without volunteering its significance. She did not ask why I noticed the lock, which a woman with nothing to conceal would certainly have done. He turned his coat collar up against the wind. "But there is something more pressing. Did you notice the time at which Percival Merodane was informed of Phelps's death?" I confessed I had not established the precise moment. He knew before we arrived. I am confident of that. The relief upon his face was not the relief of a man receiving unwelcome news in company, but of a man processing something already known and finding it, in the event, less damaging than feared. Holmes hailed a passing cab. Now, the police have examined the lodging room near Temple Bar. I very much doubt they found what they were looking for, because I very much doubt they knew what to look for. We, on the other hand, have a considerable advantage. Which is? We know, said Holmes, climbing into the cab, that whatever Phelps removed from the probate court archive was not money. It had no commercial value to any party outside this family, which means that the man who ransacked his room was not searching for something to sell. He was searching for something to destroy. He leaned back against the seat. Temple Bar, if you please, he said to the driver and to me. I think we may find the room rather more illuminating than the newspapers suggest, Watson. Robbery is a tidy explanation, and tidiness, in my experience, is frequently the first indication that something has been deliberately arranged. The cab moved off into the grey afternoon, and I sat turning over in my mind the expressions on those four faces in the drawing room. One relieved, one careful, one direct, one impenetrable, and found that I could not yet determine which of them frightened me most. Chapter 4. The Sealed Corridor. The lodging house in which Edwin Phelps had met his end stood in a narrow street south of Fleet Street, close enough to Temple Bar that the legal quarter's grey respectability cast a faint reflected light upon what was otherwise a thoroughfare of no particular distinction. The building was of the kind that London produces in great abundance. 3 stories of worn brick, a landlady of indeterminate age and determined in curiosity, and a succession of short-term tenants whose business was, by unspoken mutual agreement, their own affair. The landlady, a Mrs. Crabbe, received us in a ground-floor parlour that smelled of boiled cabbage and tallow, and regarded Holmes with the expression of a woman who has dealt with the police that morning and considers the day's quota of inconvenience to have been already met. Holmes presented his card, explained that we were acting on behalf of a party with an interest in the matter, and within 3 minutes had obtained both the key to the upstairs room and Mrs. Crabbe's comprehensive account of the previous 48 hours, which she delivered in the flat, unhurried manner of one reciting a lesson learned by repetition. Phelps had taken the room 10 days prior. He had paid a fortnight in advance, in cash, which had recommended him sufficiently. He kept irregular hours, received no visitors that she had observed, and had caused no disturbance until the disturbance of his death, which she described with a clinical brevity that suggested she regarded it primarily as a professional inconvenience. The police had been and gone. The inquest would be Wednesday. She trusted we would leave the room as we found it. The room was on the 2nd floor at the rear of the building. It had been searched with vigour and very little method. The mattress dragged from the bedstead, the single drawer of the writing table pulled out and upended, the lining of a coat hanging behind the door split along its seam. The hearth contained the cold ash of a recent fire, rather more substantial than the modest grate and mild weather would ordinarily have warranted. Holmes moved through the space with an economy of motion that I had long since ceased to find remarkable, but never ceased to admire. He did not disturb what had been disturbed. He examined the window latch, the gap between the floorboards nearest the hearth, the coat lining, and the writing table surface in turn, with a brevity that nevertheless conveyed complete attention. Then he crouched before the hearth and spent some minutes with his lens examining the ash, lifting a fragment here and there with the delicacy of a man sorting through the remnants of something irreplaceable. Paper, he said, without looking up. A good quantity of it. Some of the fragments are of a weight and texture consistent with official documents, the kind of heavy-laid stock used by the courts. He rose, dusting his knees. Phelps burned a substantial portion of whatever he took from the archive before his visitor arrived. Then whatever was taken from him was what remained after the burning, I said, or what he had the foresight to conceal before his visitor arrived, and which his visitor, despite the thoroughness of this search, failed to locate. Holmes turned slowly in the centre of the room, his gaze moving along the skirting board, the ceiling, the bedstead frame. The police concluded robbery on the evidence of empty pockets and a disordered room. The newspaper followed their conclusion, but consider, a man who has recently extracted documents from a court archive does not carry all of them in his pockets. He would have divided his material, some burned, some hidden, the least incriminating perhaps retained about his person as a token of what he possessed, which would explain why the search was so comprehensive. Precisely. A common thief takes what is visible and leaves. This room was searched by someone who knew there was something specific to find and was prepared to work for it. He crossed to the window and looked down into the yard below, and did not find it. Or we may assume so, because if they had found it, there would be no further reason to maintain the fiction of robbery, and the fiction is currently being maintained with some care. We remained in the room a further quarter of an hour. Holmes made 3 additional observations that he did not, at the time, choose to share with me in any detail. A mark on the hearthstone which he examined at length and then covered again with ash. A faint impression on the surface of the writing table, visible only in the raking light from the window, and the position of the coat upon its hook, which he adjusted by the breadth of a finger with an air of private confirmation. It was only in the cab returning to Baker Street that he volunteered the results of his thinking, and then not all of them. "The dinner at Belgrave Square," he said abruptly. I waited. "Lady Agatha told us that her household observes rigid etiquette. I have made it my business, Watson, since last night, to speak with 2 people whose acquaintance with the Merodine household gives them knowledge of its domestic arrangements." He did not specify who these people were, and I had learned not to press the question. Dinner in that house is served at 7:30 without exception. On the evening before Phelps was last seen, dinner was served at 10 minutes to 8, 20 minutes late. No member of the household appears to have remarked upon this, which suggests that the delay was explained, at least to the domestic staff, in terms they found acceptable. "A visitor?" I offered. "Possibly. Or a departure. Someone who left the house and returned, or whose expected arrival was delayed, requiring the household routine to be adjusted around them." He tapped his fingers upon his knee. "There is also the matter of the rear corridor door. In that house it is customary for the servants to secure the rear entrance at 9 in the evening. On the night in question, it was locked at 20 minutes past 7, before dinner was served and well before the ordinary hour. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, gave the instruction." "You have spoken with her?" "I have spoken with someone who has. Mrs. Finch is a woman who has kept this family's counsel for more than 2 decades, and she will not speak to us directly. Not yet. But the instruction about the door was given in the presence of the under-housemaid, who is rather less practised in discretion." A pause. "And there is the matter of the kitchen range." I confessed that I could not immediately perceive the significance of the kitchen range. At some time after midnight on the night in question, the under-housemaid is not certain of the precise hour, having been woken by sounds and then returned to sleep. The kitchen range was in use. Mrs. Finch was the only member of the household still downstairs at that hour. The smell of burning in the kitchen the following morning was attributed by the cook to a fault with the flue. Holmes turned from the window, a fault which I note has not recurred before or since. I sat with this for a moment. The rear corridor sealed early. Dinner delayed without explanation. The housekeeper burning something past midnight, alone. And somewhere within all of it, a locked writing room to which no servant was admitted after dark. "Holmes," I said, "someone was absent from that house on the evening Phelps died, and returned later than expected. That is what the delayed dinner means. It is one interpretation." His tone was measured, neither confirming nor denying. "There is, however, a second possibility which I am not yet prepared to discount, that someone was admitted to the house that evening by the rear entrance before it was locked, and departed by the same means before the household retired. A secret visitor. London is full of secret visitors, Watson. The interesting question is never who visited, but why. The visit required secrecy." He settled back against the seat. "Tomorrow I think we must speak with Lestrade. He has, I understand, formed a very definite conclusion about this business, and a very definite conclusion arrived at too quickly is frequently the most instructive thing an investigation can produce." "Instructive in what sense?" "In the sense that someone has usually helped it along," said Holmes quietly. The cab turned into Baker Street as the gas lamps were coming on along the street, and the fog had thickened again to that particular London density which reduces the world to a circle of yellow light and renders everything beyond it theoretical. I found myself thinking, as we descended to the pavement, of Mrs. Finch alone in the kitchen after midnight, feeding something to the range, her face illuminated by the fire, the rest of the house silent above her, and whatever she was burning reduced in the end to nothing that could be read. Except that Holmes, I had long since discovered, could read ash. Chapter 5. Conversations Beneath Politeness. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street the following morning uninvited, which was itself informative. In my experience, Lestrade called upon Holmes when a case had reached the stage at which official confidence and private uncertainty had begun to diverge with uncomfortable visibility. He was a lean, sharp-featured man of considerable tenacity, possessed of rather less imagination than he supposed, and rather more instinct than he credited, and he settled himself into the basket chair with the air of a man who intends to appear more comfortable than he feels. "I understand you have been making inquiries in the Phelps matter," he said, addressing Holmes with the mixture of professional wariness and reluctant respect that had characterized their association for many years. "I have been gathering information," Holmes agreed from his position by the window. "Whether it constitutes inquiries in your sense of the word is perhaps a distinction worth preserving. You have a suspect, I take it?" Lestrade permitted himself a brief look of satisfaction. "Major Lionel Vane. We have witnesses placing him near Temple Bar on the night in question. We have evidence that he met with Phelps privately 2 days before the death, and we have in his lodgings bank notes which correspond in denomination and sequence to money recently withdrawn from Phelps's bank account. I confess the cumulative weight of this struck me as considerable, and I said so. Holmes received it with equanimity. The witnesses near Temple Bar, how many, and how precise as to time? 2. A coffee-stall keeper and a woman returning from night work. Both place a tall man of military bearing in the street between 9:30 and 10:15, and Phelps was killed between 9 and 11, according to the police surgeon's estimate. Holmes turned from the window. The banknotes, Lestrade. Where precisely within Major Vane's lodgings were they found? In a bureau drawer, not hidden exactly, but folded inside a letter. The bureau was searched, I take it, quite thoroughly? Naturally. And the notes were inside a letter in a drawer. Holmes sat down. A man who was killed to conceal a bribe places the most incriminating evidence in a bureau drawer inside a letter. You find nothing to remark upon in that? Lestrade's expression suggested that he had found something to remark upon, and had resolved the difficulty to his own satisfaction. Desperate men do not always think clearly. No, Holmes agreed pleasantly, but disciplined men very nearly always do. Major Vane is a career soldier of some 20 years' standing. Whatever his present difficulties, the habits of military order do not dissolve overnight. He reached for his pipe. I am not telling you that Vane is innocent, Lestrade. I am telling you that the evidence against him has the quality of having been arranged to be found, and arranged by someone who understands what convinces policemen. Lestrade departed shortly afterwards, not entirely pleased, and Holmes remained by the fire for some minutes in a silence I did not disturb. Then he rose, reached for his coat, and announced that we were going to Belgrave Square, where he had, through Lady Agatha's somewhat reluctant consent, arranged separate interviews with 3 members of the household. We were received in a small morning room on the ground floor, plainer than the drawing-room, more used, the kind of room in which the actual business of a household is conducted between its ceremonial performances. Evelyn Harbury came first. She was, in the morning light, younger than I had estimated at our first meeting, 24 or 25 at most, with a quality of collected self-containment that sat upon her slight frame like a garment put on very carefully each morning. She answered Holmes's initial questions about her movements and general circumstances with precision and without elaboration. The manner, I thought, of someone who has learned through experience that elaboration tends to cost more than brevity. Holmes asked, after some preliminary exchanges, whether she was acquainted with the nature of the documents under review in the probate proceedings. "I know only that they concern Percival's mother's marriage," she said. "Lady Agatha has not discussed the details with me. But you are aware that the proceedings have encountered difficulties. I am aware of what the household is aware of collectively." She paused. "Mr. Holmes, Lady Agatha does not confide the family's legal affairs to me. I am a dependent relation, not a trustee." Holmes nodded slowly. "Miss Harbury, in your time in this household, have you ever encountered correspondence of a private nature, letters perhaps stored in Lady Agatha's writing room, which touched upon events in the family's past, a silence, brief but perceptible? Lady Agatha has mentioned on 2 or 3 occasions that she holds letters which were given to her in trust by Sir Edmund before his death. She has said that they concern a matter which the family resolved many years ago, and which she intends shall remain resolved." Evelyn's eyes held Holmes's steadily. "She has said this in the particular tone she uses when she means the subject is not to be revisited." "And Edwin Phelps," Holmes said, with an ease that gave the name no particular weight. "You knew he had once served as a clerk to a barrister connected to this family." Something crossed her face. Not surprise, I thought, but the recognition of information already possessed, now understood to be possessed by others. "I did not know it," she said carefully, "until quite recently." Holmes thanked her and she withdrew. He gave me a brief glance which conveyed, in the compressed vocabulary of long association, that the answer had been precisely as interesting as its careful construction suggested. Silas Broom arrived without the preliminary of being shown in, which told me he knew the house well enough to dispense with it. He was a man of 50 or thereabouts, dark-suited, with a kind of unremarkable face that is itself a professional asset, the face of a man at whom one looks and retains no strong impression. His eyes, however, were another matter, attentive, assessing, and entirely without warmth. He sat down without being invited to do so. "You wish to speak with me about the Phelps matter," he said, addressing Holmes. "I am prepared to answer what I can within the limits of my professional obligations." "Generous," said Holmes. "The inheritance case, its central difficulty concerns the legitimacy of Percival Merodine's mother's marriage abroad. A marriage certificate is the key document." "That is correct." "And you are aware that certain original documents have recently vanished from the court archive?" Broom was quiet for a moment. "I am aware that the archive has been found in disorder. Whether any documents are definitively absent has not yet been established." "The distinction between disordered and absent is a meaningful one in law," Holmes observed. "In practice, for a document that cannot be produced when required, the effect is the same. Tell me, Mr. Broom, the marriage in question, where was it contracted?" "In Lisbon, in the winter of 1861. "A civil ceremony or a religious one?" "Religious, in a Catholic church, the records of which were, I understand, subsequently damaged in a fire." Broom's voice remained even. "The original English documentation was therefore of unusual importance as corroborating evidence." "And is now unavailable?" Holmes studied the solicitor for a moment. "Mr. Broom, I shall not ask you what you know about the events of the evening Phelps died. I shall ask instead a simpler question. In your professional judgment, what is the consequence for the Merodine estate if the marriage cannot be satisfactorily proved? The inheritance passes from Percival Merodine to the next legitimate claimant under the entail," he paused fractionally, "which would be Miss Evelyn Harbury." After Broom had gone, we sat briefly in silence. Holmes refilled his pipe. "She knew about Phelps's past employment," I said. "That was plain enough." "Yes, and she was careful to say she had only recently learned it, which locates her knowledge in the period after the case became active, and distances her from any suggestion that she acted upon it." He exhaled slowly. What interests me rather more is what Broom did not say. He described the Lisbon records as damaged by fire with the ease of a man repeating a well-established fact. He did not say he had verified this independently. He did not say when the damage occurred or who had informed him of it. You suspect the fire story is false? I suspect it is old, said Holmes. And in my experience, old stories that serve present purposes deserve the same scrutiny as new ones. He rose. Mrs. Finch next, though I am not optimistic. The housekeeper received us in the same morning room with the stillness of a woman who has decided in advance exactly how much she will say and intends to say not a syllable more. She was a broad, grey-haired woman of 60, with capable hands and an expression of settled loyalty that was, in its own way, as impenetrable as armour. Holmes asked her 3 questions. She answered 2 of them, both truthfully, I believed, and both uninformatively. The third, whether she'd used the kitchen range on the night in question, she met with a composed silence that was itself a kind of answer, and Holmes didn't press it. In the hall, he paused at the foot of the stairs and looked upward for a moment, toward the upper floor. Every conversation in this house, he said quietly, avoids one subject with perfect consistency. Do you notice what it is, Watson? I considered the morning's interviews. Evelyn Harbury on the letters held in trust, Broom on the marriage certificate and its vanished corroboration, Mrs. Finch on everything she had not said. Legitimacy, I said. Holmes put on his hat. The word has not been spoken once, he said, and walked out into the cold. Chapter 6. The Fear of Exposure. There are cases which announce themselves through their violence, and cases which announce themselves through their silence, and it has been my observation, across the many years of my association with Sherlock Holmes, that the latter variety are invariably the more dangerous. Violence is in some respects honest. It declares itself. The machinery of concealment, by contrast, operates below the surface of events, and by the time it becomes visible, it has generally been operating for a very long time. I was reflecting upon something of this nature 2 mornings after our interviews at Belgrave Square, when Holmes returned to Baker Street from an absence of nearly 18 hours, with the look he sometimes wore after extended solitary effort. Not the animation of discovery precisely, but the composed alertness of a man who has found what he expected to find and is now determining what it signifies. He dropped into his chair without removing his coat, stretched his legs toward the fire, and stared at the ceiling for the better part of 3 minutes before speaking. The marriage in Lisbon, he said, November 1861. A woman named Catherine Voss, later Catherine Merrodine, wed a man identified in the English documentation as James Arthur Merrodine, younger brother of Sir Edmund at the Church of San Domingos. The child of that marriage, born the following year, was the boy who became Percival. You have verified this? I have verified that this is the account which the documentation supports, or supported, before portions of it disappeared from the probate archive. What I have also established, and this required rather more effort, is that James Arthur Merrodine died in Lisbon in October of 1861. 1 month before the marriage he is recorded as having contracted. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, a cart moved slowly along Baker Street, its wheels loud on the wet stone. The certificate is forged, I said. The certificate records a marriage between a dead man and a living woman, which is at the very least a logistical difficulty. Holmes drew his coat more closely around him, as though the cold of whatever damp archive had occupied his night still clung to him. The question of how it came to exist, and who created it, belongs to 30 years ago, and is not, for our immediate purposes, the most pressing inquiry. What concerns us now is who else knows of this discrepancy, and what they have done or are prepared to do with the knowledge. Edwin Phelps, Holmes explained, had encountered the inconsistency not by some feat of detection, but by the ordinary operation of a thorough and retentive mind. During his years as a clerk to the barrister connected with the Merrodine affairs, He had handled correspondence relating to James Arthur Merodine's death in Portugal, correspondence which, through the accumulation of years and the general amnesia that descends upon old legal chambers, had been presumed forgotten. When the probate proceedings brought the marriage certificate before his division, Phelps had recognised the discrepancy between the dates and understood, with the acuity of a man who has spent his career understanding the value of information, precisely what he held. He had not gone immediately to the authorities. That, Holmes observed, would have been the action of a man of principle, which Phelps had not been. Instead, he had done what his character and his circumstances alike inclined him toward. He had made private contact with a party whose interests the disclosure would most directly damage, and he had proposed an arrangement. He approached Lady Agatha, I said. He approached Lady Agatha, who was known of the irregularity in the marriage certificate for, I suspect, a very great deal longer than Phelps imagined. Holmes rose at last and moved to the window, his hands behind his back. Consider her position, Watson. She has maintained this family's respectability for 4 years since Sir Edmund's death, and for how many years before that in service of the same project. Percival is not merely a nephew to her. He is the embodiment of a construction that has required, one imagines, considerable sustained effort. To have that construction threatened now, in public, before the probate court, by a blackmailing court usher armed with old correspondence, the prospect would have been intolerable. And yet she came to you. She invited scrutiny. Holmes turned from the window, which is the most interesting thing about her, and the detail I have turned over most carefully. He was quiet for a moment. She came to us before Phelps was found dead. She presented the situation as a matter of potential scandal. A bribe, a disappearance, the family name in proximity to unsavoury proceedings. She asked for information and discretion. What she did not do, I now believe, was tell us the truth about what she feared. Because if she had told us the truth, I said slowly, we would have been investigating not a missing usher, but a forged marriage certificate. And everything that follows from one, he returned to his chair. She's a woman of considerable intelligence, Watson. She understood that an inquiry framed around Phelps's disappearance might resolve itself quietly. An inquiry framed around a forgery 30 years old most certainly would not. I set down my cup. The morning had acquired a different quality, as mornings sometimes do when a matter one has been approaching obliquely suddenly presents its full face. And the money, I said. If the forgery were exposed, the estate would pass to Evelyn Harbury. Percival would be ruined. The family name would be destroyed, but the exposure would also benefit Evelyn financially, which gives her a motive to help Phelps rather than hinder him. Unless, said Holmes, she had no knowledge of her own position under the entail, which is entirely possible. Broome informed us of that provision with the air of a man sharing incidental legal detail. I am not certain Miss Harbury knows she stands to inherit. He pressed his fingertips together. And here is what strikes me as the most curious element of the entire affair. If the motive were purely financial, if someone wished simply to benefit from the exposure, they could have allowed Phelps to proceed. The revelation would have served them perfectly. Instead, everyone in that house is terrified of public inquiry, not merely inconvenienced by it. Terrified. Because the scandal would outlast any financial benefit, I suggested. Because the scandal would destroy the only thing any of them actually possesses. Holmes said it with a kind of clinical sadness. They have no real money between them. What they have is standing, association with the Merodine name, with Sir Edmund's reputation, with the particular variety of English respectability that Belgrave Square represents. Expose the forgery, and all of that dissolves. Percival loses the inheritance, yes, but they all lose the house, the address, the social position. For Lady Agatha it would be complete annihilation. For Evelyn, whatever inheritance she might legally claim would be poisoned at its source. We sat with this for a moment, Outside, London continued its ordinary business with characteristic indifference to the private catastrophes occurring within its houses. "Holmes," I said, "Lady Agatha met privately with Phelps. You said you believed this." "I believe it occurred at least twice. The sealed corridor and the delayed dinner suggest the second meeting took place at Belgrave Square itself, which means she admitted a blackmailer to her own house through the rear entrance and sat with him in her writing room to negotiate terms." He paused. "And yet he died, which means the negotiation did not conclude satisfactorily for all concerned." "Or that a third party intervened?" "Precisely." His voice was quiet but very certain. "Lady Agatha feared exposure above all things, but she is not, I think, a woman who would risk compounding one catastrophe with another. There is someone else in this, Watson, someone who concluded that negotiation was insufficient and that Phelps had to be silenced rather than managed." He reached for his pipe, and that person made one error in an otherwise careful sequence of actions, which I intend to identify before the day is out. He did not tell me what the error was. That evening he was absent again, and I sat by the Baker Street fire, turning the case over in my mind. The forged certificate, the dead usher, the terrified household. I thought of Evelyn Harbury's careful answers, of Broom's unremarkable face and watchful eyes, of Mrs. Finch at the kitchen range past midnight. Somewhere within those three figures lay the answer Holmes was approaching, and I found, as the fire burned low, that I could not yet determine which of them he was closing upon. What I knew, with the certainty that long experience of Holmes's methods had given me, was that he was closing. Chapter 7. The Convenient Theory. The arrest of Major Lionel Vane was reported in the morning papers 3 days later, with the particular satisfaction the press reserves for conclusions that confirm what it had already decided. The Daily Chronicle ran a column and a half. The Standard was more restrained, but no less certain. Aristocratic corruption, gambling debts, a bribed official silenced before he could speak. It was, as narratives go, entirely coherent, and its coherence was precisely what disturbed me as I read it across the breakfast table, while Holmes sat motionless in his chair with his eyes closed and his pipe gone cold in his hand. "They have him on 3 counts, I said, setting the paper down. "The witnesses near Temple Bar, the banknotes, and a letter found in his bureau, which Lestrade apparently regards as conclusive." "The letter," said Holmes, without opening his eyes. "What does it say?" "The paper does not reproduce it. It describes it as containing language which suggests Vane was aware of Phelps's activities and intended to profit from them." Holmes opened his eyes. Suggests. Intended. The language of inference rather than statement. He rose, moved to the mantelpiece, and knocked the dead tobacco from his pipe with 3 precise taps. A letter containing direct evidence of guilt would have been described as containing direct evidence of guilt. A letter described as suggesting guilt is a letter that requires interpretation, and interpretation is a thing that can be managed. He turned. "I should very much like to read that letter." Through channels which Holmes possessed, and I did not, we were, by the early afternoon, in a small room at Scotland Yard where Lestrade received us with the provisional cordiality of a man whose position has recently improved and who is not yet certain whether Holmes's involvement will complicate matters. He laid the letter before us on the table, with the air of producing a trump card. It was written on plain paper, undated in a hand I did not recognise. The substance of it was this: that the writer was aware of Vane's meetings with Phelps, that the matter they had discussed could not be permitted to proceed as planned, and that Vane would be wise to withdraw from the affair entirely, whatever the financial consequence. It was signed with initials only. S.B. Holmes read it twice. Then he set it down and regarded Lestrade with an expression of such careful neutrality that I recognised it immediately as the expression he wore when he was being most attentive. "S.B.," he said. "You have identified the author?" "We believe the initials belong to a Samuel Bridges, a moneylender with whom Vane has had dealings. We are pursuing the inquiry." "Of course you are," said Holmes pleasantly. He returned the letter. "Tell me, Lestrade, When precisely was this letter found? During the second search of Vane's rooms, the day after his arrest, not during the first search. Lestrade's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. These things are sometimes overlooked initially. Indeed they are. Holmes rose and buttoned his coat. Thank you, Lestrade. I shall not take more of your time. In the corridor outside, I fell into step beside him. The letter was not there during the first search, which was conducted on the morning following the arrest, when Vane's rooms would have been fresh and undisturbed. He moved at pace through the tiled corridor toward the exit, a letter proving guilty knowledge, placed in a bureau drawer between the first and second searches of a man already in custody. The moneylender connection is a convenience that will not survive scrutiny. SB could stand for any number of names, and a clever forger would choose initials that deflect rather than identify. He pushed open the door into the grey afternoon. Vane openly discussed his debts with his acquaintances at his club, Watson. I have confirmed this. A man who talks freely about his financial embarrassments in company is not the same animal as a man who commits murder to conceal them. The psychology is entirely inconsistent. Then someone is building a case against him. Someone has been building it with considerable care and patience. The witnesses, the banknotes, and now the letter, each element placed where it would be found, at intervals designed to accumulate into certainty. He hailed a cab. It is, in its own way, an impressive piece of work. The difficulty for its author is that impressive pieces of work require effort, and effort leaves traces. We drove not to Baker Street but east, toward the city, and Holmes spent the journey in a focused silence that I did not interrupt. We stopped in a narrow street not far from Chancery Lane, where Holmes directed the cab to wait, and led me into a building that housed, on its upper floors, the chambers of a retired barrister. The man we had come to see was elderly, somewhat infirm, and appeared to have been expecting Holmes, which suggested that the visit was not as spontaneous as it had appeared. He received us in a room of remarkable disorder, papers everywhere, the accumulation of a long professional life, and spoke for 20 minutes while Holmes listened with complete attention, and I took notes at Holmes's quiet direction. The barrister's name was Aubrey Lisle. He was the man in whose chambers Edwin Phelps had served as a clerk, and he was, it became clear within the first minutes of conversation, a man who had carried a piece of knowledge for a very long time, and was experiencing the complex relief of one finally permitted to set it down. He spoke of the Merowden case as he had known it 30 years before, of James Arthur Merowden's death in Lisbon, of the correspondence he had handled at the time, of the gap between the dates which he had noticed and which had been, he said, explained to him by Sir Edmund Merowden in person. Sir Edmund had been a man of great distinction and unquestioned probity in all his public dealings. He had told Lisle that the dating discrepancy in the marriage certificate was the result of clerical error in the original Portuguese church records, a common enough occurrence in foreign jurisdictions at that period, and that the matter had been reviewed by the appropriate parties and resolved. Lisle had accepted this. He had accepted it because Sir Edmund said it, and because Sir Edmund was the kind of man whose word in 1861 was itself a form of documentation. "And now?" Holmes asked. "And now Phelps is dead," said the old man quietly, "and I find I am less certain of the explanation than I was 30 years ago." In the cab returning westward, Holmes was quiet for some time. When he spoke, it was not about Lisle or about Sir Edmund, but about Silas Broom. The solicitor understood the architecture of the case better than anyone, he said. He has managed the Merowden affairs for years, which means he knows where every stone is laid and what lies under it. He knew of Phelps's prior connection to Lisle's chambers. He would have had to know in the course of his own research into the family's legal history, and when Phelps reappeared as the usher handling the very proceedings that touched the family's oldest secret, Broom would have understood the danger immediately. Before Lady Agatha did, perhaps, I said. Quite possibly before she did. Which raises the question of whether Lady Agatha's private meetings with Phelps were of her own initiative, or whether Broom arranged them on her behalf, as her solicitor, while managing his own response to the problem separately. He looked out at the passing streets. A solicitor who acts in his client's interest and a solicitor who acts in his own interest sometimes perform identical actions for very different reasons. The actions are visible. The reasons require rather more work to establish. I asked what Broom stood to gain from Phelps's death and the conviction of Major Vane. Holmes considered. If Vane is convicted, the inquiry closes. The story becomes one of gambling debts and a bribed official murdered for knowing too much. No one looks further. No one examines probate documents or Lisbon church records or 30-year-old correspondence in retired barristers' chambers. A pause. And no one asks why the family solicitor, who had every reason to know of the crisis approaching the Merodine proceedings, said nothing to prevent it, and everything at the critical moment to ensure that it was attributed to someone else. He said it without drama, looking not at me but at the city moving past the window, and the matter-of-factness of it made it somehow more severe than any emphasis could have done. That evening Holmes wrote 2 letters. He sealed them both without showing me their contents, gave them to Mrs. Hudson for the Morning Post, and spent the remainder of the night at his violin. Not the disconnected fragments of restlessness, but something sustained and almost deliberate, as though the music were performing some necessary internal function that had no other means of expression. I understood, lying awake in the small hours listening to it, that we were approaching the end of the case. Holmes played that way only when the shape of a thing had become fully clear to him, when all that remained was the ungainly business of proving what he already knew. Chapter 8. The Woman at the Window. Holmes's 2 letters produced results within 48 hours, though not in the form I had anticipated. The first reply arrived by the afternoon post, a single sheet, brief and unhesitating, which Holmes read and placed in his breast pocket without comment. The second arrived the following morning, delivered by a private messenger rather than through the ordinary post, and this one he read twice before folding it with a precision that suggested its contents required careful storage in the mind as well as in the pocket. He said nothing of either letter. What he did instead was spend the better part of 2 days in movements, which he described only partially, and which appeared, from what little I could piece together, to involve the General Register Office, a telegraph exchange in the city, and at least one conversation with a contact in Edinburgh, whose name he did not share. He returned each evening looking not tired, but concentrated, in the manner of a lens brought to its proper focal point, and he ate his supper with an appetite that was itself a kind of evidence. Holmes ate well only when he was satisfied. On the 3rd morning he appeared in the sitting-room at 8:30, fully dressed, and announced that he had arranged an evening gathering at Belgrave Square. "A gathering," I repeated. "Lady Agatha has agreed to assemble the principal members of the household after dinner. I have told her that I have information bearing upon the case which I wish to share before deciding whether to bring it to the attention of the police." He poured his coffee with entire composure. The framing was deliberate. Each person in that room will arrive this evening having spent the day imagining what the information might be and how it might affect them. Imagination, in my experience, does a great deal of the preparatory work. And what is the information? Holmes set down his cup. There is a duplicate certificate. A copy of the relevant documentation was made by the Lisbon Church at the time of the original registration and forwarded, in accordance with Portuguese ecclesiastical practice of the period, to a diocesan archive in Edinburgh. I stared at him. "Is that true?" "It is true that such a practice existed and that I have been in contact with Edinburgh to determine whether any relevant material survive." He allowed a brief pause. "Whether the specific certificate exists is a question whose answer I intend to observe rather than announce." The evening was clear and cold, the fog of recent days having lifted to reveal a November sky of remarkable sharpness. The Merodine house received us at 9 o'clock with every appearance of its customary order. Lamps lit, Mrs. Finch at the door, the drawing-room arranged with that particular geometry of furniture which suggests that someone has been thinking about it, rather more than they normally would. They were all there. Lady Agatha occupied her usual chair near the fire with the posture of a woman who has decided that dignity is the only weapon remaining to her, and intends to deploy it to the last. Percival stood near the mantelpiece in the attitude of a man who has placed himself where retreat is possible. Evelyn Harbury sat slightly apart from the others, her hands folded in her lap, her attention fixed on Holmes with the quality of stillness that I had come to associate with persons who are managing a significant interior effort. Silas Broom had taken a chair at the edge of the group, angled very slightly away from the others, his face as unremarkable and watchful as it had been at every previous encounter. Holmes stood before them without preamble. "I am grateful to Lady Agatha for permitting this meeting," he said. "I shall be brief. In the course of my inquiry into the death of Edwin Phelps and the circumstances surrounding the Merrodine probate proceedings, I have had occasion to correspond with archival authorities in Edinburgh. It appears that a duplicate of the marriage certificate central to the inheritance case may have survived in a diocesan record collection. If so, its contents would be decisive." He stopped there. The room was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of people processing information, and then it ceased to be quiet in a way that told me a great deal. Percival's colour left him with a swiftness that was almost physical, as though something had been withdrawn from beneath his feet. He gripped the mantelpiece with one hand, a gesture so involuntary that he appeared not to notice he had made it, and his face arranged itself into an expression of controlled alarm that was, I thought, the most honest expression I had seen on it. Whatever charm he habitually deployed, it had entirely deserted him. What remained was simple fear. Silas Broom did not move. His face did not change. His eyes, however, moved to Percival for a fraction of a second with an expression I could not immediately name. Not alarm, not calculation, but something more like the rapid reassessment of a man reviewing a position he had believed to be secure. Evelyn Harbury looked at neither of them. She looked at Holmes, and she wept. Not dramatically, she made no sound, and she did not raise her hands to her face. 2 tears simply descended her cheeks in the manner of grief that has been suppressed so long it has learned to express itself with minimum disturbance. I found it, in its quietness, more affecting than any outburst could have been, and Lady Agatha gripped the arms of her chair. It was the only movement she made, but it was unmistakable. The knuckles whitened. The composure she had maintained with such consummate skill across every previous encounter fractured for a moment into something rawer and more ancient. Not the fear of social disgrace, but the fear of a woman who has spent 30 years constructing something and sees it, in an instant, threatened with destruction. The portrait of Sir Edmund gazed down from above the mantelpiece, and beneath it his widow held her chair and said nothing. Holmes observed all of this in approximately 4 seconds. Then he spoke again, and his voice was, if anything, rather quieter than before. "There is one further matter which the Edinburgh correspondence has clarified. The question of James Arthur Merrodin's movements in Lisbon in the autumn of 1861 is rather more fully documented than has previously been supposed. Specifically, the date of his death, as recorded in the consular register, predates the marriage certificate by 31 days. The silence that followed this was of a different order entirely. Percival turned away from the room entirely and faced the wall above the fireplace. His shoulders were rigid. Evelyn's weeping continued in its same quiet fashion. Broom, after a moment, unclasped his hands and reclasped them, the only sign of agitation in an otherwise exterior of stone. Lady Agatha spoke. "What is it you intend to do, Mr. Holmes?" It was asked with great control, and the control was itself an act of considerable courage. She was not pleading. She was not capitulating. She was asking a direct question, as a general might ask the terms of a siege, because she understood the position and would not pretend otherwise. Holmes regarded her for a long moment before answering. "At present, Lady Agatha, I intend nothing beyond what I have told you. I am in possession of information. What becomes of it depends, in part, upon what this room is willing to tell me about the night Edwin Phelps died. His voice had no hardness in it, and no softness either. Phelps did not die by design. I believe that. But someone in this room, or connected to it, made choices on that night whose consequences have fallen upon a man who has no part in this family's history and no cause to bear them. Major Vane's name was not spoken. It did not need to be. The fire burned. Evelyn looked at her hands. Percival still faced the wall, and Silas Broom, after the longest pause in a room that had been full of pauses, drew a breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a preparation for speech, but something that occupied the uncertain territory between resolution and reluctance. Holmes turned toward him with the patience of a man who has all evening and knows it. It was, I understood in that moment, not a revelation Holmes had staged, but a test he had designed. The Edinburgh certificate, whatever its precise status, had served its purpose. The room had answered him, each face in its own language, and he had read every one of them. What he had confirmed, I was now certain, was not merely a fact about a document. It was the architecture of a crime, seen at last without the careful construction of appearances that had concealed it. And at its centre, still and watchful, sat the man with the unremarkable face, deciding whether to speak or to hold his silence one moment longer. Chapter 9. Holmes explains the motive. Broom spoke first, which was itself instructive, not in the manner of a man confessing. There was nothing precipitous in it, no sudden unburdening of the kind that dramatic convention leads one to expect. He spoke the way he did everything, with precision, with economy, and with the careful attention to implication that marks the professional mind even under pressure. He uncrossed his legs, reclasped his hands once upon his knee, and addressed Holmes as though they were resuming a conversation that had merely been interrupted by the other's presence. "You mentioned," he said, "that what becomes of your information depends in part upon what this room is willing to tell you. I should like to understand the limits of that proposition before I determine what I am willing to say." "The limits are straightforward," Holmes replied. "A man is presently in custody for a crime he did not commit. That cannot be permitted to stand, whatever else is permitted to stand beside it. On the question of everything else, I have not yet reached a settled view." Broom considered this. The fire shifted. No one else in the room moved. "Then I will tell you what occurred," said Broom, "because the alternative is worse, and because I am, regardless of what you or anyone else may conclude about my conduct, a man who understands when a position has become untenable." He told it without self-pity and without excessive qualification, which was the only thing about the account that I found entirely to his credit. The substance of it confirmed, in its broad outline, what Holmes had already reconstructed, but the particulars were grimmer, and the moral geography rather more complicated than any outline could have suggested. Phelps had made contact with Broom first, not with Lady Agatha. He had written a letter, oblique enough to be deniable if required, indicating that in the course of his duties he had encountered materials touching upon the Meraldine proceedings, which might, if examined by certain parties, prove inconvenient. He proposed a meeting to discuss terms. Broom had attended that meeting alone, without Lady Agatha's knowledge, because he judged, correctly as it proved, that Lady Agatha's involvement would complicate negotiations which required, above all, clarity. The terms Phelps proposed were not primarily financial. He wanted a position, something secure, respectable, and sufficiently well remunerated to allow him to retire from the probate division without the appearance of flight. He understood, he told Broom at that first meeting, that the Meraldine family was in no condition to purchase expensive silence. But he was a reasonable man and a modest one, and he was prepared to accept a modest arrangement. Broom had agreed, provisionally, and had then done two things. The first was to inform Lady Agatha, selectively and carefully, telling her that a former court official had identified certain irregularities in the inheritance documents, and had been persuaded at some cost to remain silent. He did not tell her the full nature of those irregularities, because Lady Agatha, he had long understood, knew rather more about the origins of the marriage certificate than she had ever directly acknowledged, and the precise degree of her knowledge was a card he preferred to keep in reserve. The second thing he did was search Phelps's lodgings. He said this without flinching, and the manner of its saying made clear that he had not searched them himself. He was, his tone implied, a man of sufficient resources to delegate such tasks. What his agent found in the room at Temple Bar was a portion of the materials Phelps had taken from the court archive, along with correspondence suggesting that Phelps had not, in fact, approached Broom exclusively. There was evidence that he had written also to Percival Merrodin directly. "That changed everything," said Broom. "A man negotiating with one party can be managed. A man playing multiple parties against one another cannot be trusted to hold any arrangement, regardless of what is offered." "And so you arranged a second meeting," said Holmes, "at this house." "I arranged it here because I wished Lady Agatha to be present. It seemed to me that the time had come for her to understand the full extent of what Phelps knew, and for Phelps to understand that he was dealing not merely with a solicitor acting in a client's interest, but with a family that had considerably more to lose than he had fully appreciated." He paused. The meeting was held in Lady Agatha's writing room at 7:30 in the evening, after Phelps had entered by the rear corridor. Holmes nodded, and the dinner was delayed because the meeting ran past the expected hour. By some 20 minutes, yes, Phelps had become difficult. He had obtained, in addition to what we knew of, a letter. A private letter written by Sir Edmund Merrodin in 1862 to the solicitor, then acting for the family, which addressed the question of the marriage certificate with a frankness that Sir Edmund presumably believed to be protected by professional privilege. A brief silence. It was not protected from Phelps, who had found it among the papers in Liesl's chambers when he served there as a junior clerk, and who had kept it for 30 years without understanding fully what he held. "Until the proceedings brought it back into relevance," said Holmes. "Until then. With that letter, he felt himself to be in a considerably stronger position than I had supposed. He became, in the course of that meeting, what I can only describe as reckless. He said things which it would not serve anyone's interest for me to repeat in their precise form." Broom's gaze moved briefly to Lady Agatha, who had not stirred from her chair and whose expression had passed through several registers during this account, before settling into something that was neither acquiescence nor denial, but the peculiar stillness of a person hearing their own history narrated by another, and finding it simultaneously accurate and unrecognisable. "I attempted to recover the letter by argument," Broom continued, "then by offer. When neither succeeded, I reached for it. Phelps resisted. The struggle was brief and I think surprising to both of us. He was not a young man, and neither am I. He fell backward. The corner of the hearthstone caught the back of his head. He stopped. When he resumed, his voice was precisely the same in register and pace as it had been throughout. He was dead within a few minutes. I believe he felt very little." The room was absolutely still. Holmes, who had listened to the entire account without interruption, spoke now in a tone that was measured and, I thought, deliberately devoid of the judgment that the occasion might otherwise have warranted. "What followed?" he said. "The staging, the banknotes, the letter placed in Vane's bureau. Mrs. Finch was called in. She had served this family for 22 years, and she understood, without detailed explanation, what was required. She burned what needed burning. Materials from Phelps's pockets and the writing-room table, while I returned to his lodgings that night with the purpose of recovering whatever remained there. I did not find the letter." He said it flatly. "I believe he had not brought it to the meeting. It is almost certainly still in that room." Holmes reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper. He held it for a moment without opening it. "The floorboards," said I suddenly, recalling the mark on the hearthstone, the impression on the writing table, and then the third thing Holmes had examined in the Temple bar-room, the gap between the boards nearest the hearth. Holmes looked at me with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Phelps's precaution was a sensible one," he said. He had loosened a board near the fire. The warmth keeps such gaps slightly wider than elsewhere, which makes them easier to work with, and concealed the letter beneath it. It was not difficult to locate once one understood that a man who expected a dangerous meeting would not carry his strongest material into it. He opened the sheet now, and held it briefly so that Broom, across the room, could see Sir Edmund's handwriting on paper that had yellowed with 30 years. Broom looked at it for a long moment and then looked away, not in defeat so much as in the recognition of a geometry that had closed around him completely. "The matter of Vane," Holmes said, "must be corrected before tomorrow morning. I've already written to Lestrade outlining the sequence of events. My letter will have reached him by now." He turned to address the room as a whole, his gaze moving briefly across Percival's rigid back, Evelyn's quiet face, Lady Agatha's white hands upon the chair arms. "What I have communicated to Lestrade concerns the death of Edwin Phelps and the means by which suspicion was directed elsewhere. It does not, as yet, address the question of the inheritance." Lady Agatha spoke for the second time that evening. Her voice was steady, though it cost her something to make it so. "This was never truly about money," she said. "I wonder if you understand that, Mr. Holmes?" "I understand it completely," he replied. "It is, in some respects, the most important thing about the case." He picked up his hat from the side table. "A ruined fortune may recover. The sentiment is not original to you, Lady Agatha, but it is entirely correct. What cannot recover, what you have spent 30 years ensuring would not be required to recover, is something of a different order altogether." He did not say the word. He had said, some days earlier, that the word had not been spoken once in that house, and he was not the man to introduce it now, with everything else unresolved and the night still long. But Evelyn Harbury, rising quietly from her chair, as Holmes moved toward the door, spoke it, quite softly, without accusation, in the tone of a woman who has only just understood the full dimensions of the room she has been living in. "Legitimacy," she said. No one answered her. Chapter 10. The Reordering of the House. The weeks that followed the gathering at Belgrave Square moved with the peculiar combination of speed and deliberateness that characterises the machinery of English law when it has been set in proper motion. Lestrade, to his credit, received Holmes's communication with rather more grace than might have been expected of a man whose most visible success had just been withdrawn from under him. Major Vane was released before noon the following day, the case against him quietly decomposed by the simple expedient of Holmes presenting the recovered letter, Sir Edmund's 30-year-old private correspondence extracted from beneath the floorboards of a Temple Bar lodging-house, to the appropriate authorities with a brief account of how it had come to be there. I called upon Vane some days after his release. He received me in his modest rooms near Pimlico with the uncertain manner of a man whose circumstances have been recently and dramatically revised and who has not yet entirely caught up with the revision. He was grateful, he said, in the particular way of people for whom gratitude is slightly unfamiliar territory, formally, with effort, and with something underneath it that was rather more genuine than the form. He did not ask many questions. I believe he had decided, in whatever long hours the cell afforded him for reflection, that some things were better understood incompletely. Silas Broom was charged with manslaughter rather than murder, Holmes having argued with both precision and evident conviction that the evidence supported death by misadventure, arising from a struggle rather than any premeditated design upon Phelps's life. The distinction was not trivial. Holmes had told me, on our return from Belgrave Square on the night of Broom's account, that the staging of the scene and the deliberate direction of suspicion toward Vane were, in his view, considerably more culpable than the death itself, which had the character of consequence rather than intention. The law agreed, partially and in its own time. Broom faced prosecution on the graver charge of perverting the course of justice, to which the manslaughter was annexed. He met it, according to all subsequent reports, with the same composed attention to practical reality that had characterised his account in the drawing-room. Mrs. Finch was not charged with any offence. Holmes communicated to the relevant parties his view that her actions, burning materials at her employer's direction, keeping a counsel she had kept for 20 years, were not of the character that the law's intervention would meaningfully address, and that her situation was punishment of a sufficient kind in itself. She left Belgrave Square within a fortnight, by her own choice, and I do not know where she went. The question of the inheritance was resolved by the courts over several subsequent months, in proceedings of which I followed only the outline. The forged marriage certificate was formally repudiated. Percival Merodin, to the considerable surprise of those who had known him primarily as a man of easy manners and expensive habits, renounced his claim voluntarily and without apparent compulsion shortly before the court would in any case have disposed of it. Holmes remarked, when I told him this, that voluntary renunciation was the shrewder course. It allowed Percival to exit with something resembling dignity, which was more than the alternative offered, and that the decision suggested a more practical intelligence beneath the charm than had been previously visible. He said it without contempt, which was itself a kind of generosity. The estate passed, through the operation of a provision in the original Merodin settlement, which Broome himself had evidently never troubled to examine with sufficient care to Evelyn Harbury. The reduced estate, for the legal proceedings and their attendant costs had diminished it considerably, was not the fortune that the name had once suggested, but it was real, and it was hers, and she received it with the composed quietness that had characterized her throughout. I called upon her some weeks after the settlement was confirmed, ostensibly to deliver some papers Holmes had asked me to return to the house, and found her in the morning room surrounded by packing boxes, overseeing the methodical disassembly of a household that had defined the outer boundaries of her life for 3 years. She seemed, if I may say so, lighter, not happy in any simple sense. The circumstances did not permit simplicity, but relieved of some sustained internal effort, as though a posture held for a very long time had been finally permitted to relax. She thanked me for Holmes's assistance in terms that were brief and entirely sincere, and she asked me to convey to him her particular appreciation for the fact that he had not made more of certain things than the situation required. I delivered this message to Holmes that same evening at Baker Street, where he was engaged in one of his chemical experiments, and had reduced the sitting room to a state which Mrs. Hudson regarded with an expression combining resignation and Christian fortitude in roughly equal measure. He received Evelyn's thanks with a brief nod and returned his attention to the apparatus before him. Then, after a moment, he said, "She is more perceptive than most of the people we encounter. She understood from the outset considerably more than she admitted, and rather less than she feared." I asked what he meant by this. She knew or suspected that the inheritance rested on uncertain ground. She did not know the precise nature of the uncertainty, but she had lived long enough in Lady Agatha's house to understand that certain subjects were maintained in a state of careful avoidance. Whether she connected this awareness to her own potential position under the entail, I cannot say with certainty. But her weeping, on the night of the gathering, was not entirely for Percival. I reflected on this. For herself, perhaps, for what it cost to know. Knowledge of that variety is never simply an acquisition, said Holmes, adjusting a gas tap with the absorbed attention he brought to laboratory work. It reorganises what surrounds it. Lady Agatha Merodin withdrew from society shortly after the settlement was confirmed. There was no formal announcement, no public explanation. She simply ceased to appear at the functions and engagements that had constituted her social existence, and the world of Belgrave Square received her withdrawal with the polite indifference it extends to all subtractions from its number. She remained in the house, reduced now in staff, and in all the minor ceremonial observances that had structured its days, and whether she found peace there, or merely a more private form of the discipline she had always imposed on herself, I could not say. I did not call upon her again, and Holmes never suggested that I should. It was Holmes himself who, in the quiet of a December evening some weeks after the case had resolved itself into its several conclusions, offered the only summary of it I ever heard him make. We had dined, and the fire was burning well, and London outside was doing what London does best in December, producing a darkness so thorough and a cold so penetrating that the lit windows of Baker Street seemed, in contrast, almost improbably warm and particular. Holmes had been silent for the better part of an hour, occupied with a book he was not reading, when he set it aside and looked at the fire with the expression he sometimes wore at the end of cases, not satisfaction exactly, and not dissatisfaction, but the particular quality of attention that follows the completion of one kind of work and precedes the identification of the next. England's great houses, he said after a moment, are in many respects the most intricate structures in this country, not architecturally. He paused. They are built of carefully maintained appearances, Watson. The brickwork is reputation. The mortar is the collective agreement of all those within and around the house to believe and to behave as though the appearance is the reality. He turned from the fire. When one element fails, when a court usher notices a date, when a letter surfaces after 30 years, the entire structure does not necessarily collapse, but it must be rebuilt, and the rebuilding is always more visible than the original construction. He picked up the book again, then set it down once more. Phelps understood the structure. That was his leverage. What he failed to understand was that the people who live inside such a construction are not always aware of how extensively they have built their own existence around it, how completely the appearance has become, in their own minds, indistinguishable from the truth. A man who threatens to expose an illusion believes he is exposing it to people who know it is an illusion. He is often wrong. He said nothing further on the subject that evening, and I did not press him. But I noted it carefully, as I have always noted the moments when Holmes speaks not merely about a case, but about what the case has demonstrated to him about the species he spends his life observing. They are rarer than his deductions and, in my estimation, no less precise. I have set down this account as faithfully as my memory and my notes allow. The case of Edwin Phelps, of the Merrodine inheritance, of the sealed corridor and the kitchen range and the letter beneath the floorboards, was not among the most dramatic of Holmes's investigations. There were no moments of physical danger, no pursuit through the city streets, no confrontation at which violence threatened. What it possessed, in place of those things, was a quality which I have come to value more highly with the passage of years. It exposed, with the quiet precision that was Holmes's particular gift, the machinery by which reputation governs the conduct of men and women who have ceased to distinguish between what they are and what they are seen to be. In solving the mystery, Holmes had not merely uncovered a crime. He had traced along the thread of a single forged certificate the line between the life a family had lived and the life it had persuaded itself and others to believe it lived. Whether that distinction brought any of the people involved to something resembling peace, I cannot report with confidence. What I can report is that on the morning after the Belgrave Square gathering, the fog lifted entirely for the first time in a fortnight, and Baker Street lay in a thin November sunlight that made even its familiar shabbiness look, for an hour or two, almost clean. Holmes observed this from the window, his coffee cooling at his elbow, and said nothing. But he watched the light for rather longer than was strictly necessary, and I thought, though I did not say so, that in its own small way this too was a kind of observation.